in the shadowed corridors of history, where the dust of forgotten empires settles over the high plateau of Mexico, there lies the story of the people of the sun. Long before the white sails from the east pierced the horizon, a tribe of wanderers moved through the mists of the north, guided by a prophecy carved into blood and stone. They were the Mexica, the future architects of a world where water would glide like silver through stone arteries, and where the heartbeat of a nation would be bound to the very survival of the cosmos. This is not simply a tale of conquest or collapse. It is a deep journey into a civilization that read the sky like a sacred book, that tamed swamp and lake with stubborn genius, and that was ultimately devoured by the very gods it tried so desperately to appease. The drums of Tenochtitlan have long since fallen silent, yet their echoes still ride the wind over the valley. Welcome to the heart of the fifth sun. Welcome to the world of the Aztecs, before the grandeur of stone pyramids, before the crowded markets of the valley and the glimmer of obsidian blades. There was only the mist. To understand the Aztecs, one must walk backwards through time, beyond the reach of written records, to a place that lives halfway between reality and dream. Aztlán, the ancestral cradle, the place of whiteness, or the place of the herons. In the ancient codices, Aztlán appears as an island surrounded by water, a serene and fertile land where life moved in a gentle rhythm with the seasons. But Aztlán was more than a dot on a forgotten map. It was a spiritual point of departure, the sacred starting line of a journey that would reshape the history of the Americas. The legends speak of a northern realm, perhaps somewhere in the deserts of what is now the southwestern United States, or hidden among the rugged mountains of Nayarit. In this primeval paradise stood Chickamastock, the place of 7 caves. Here, 7 tribes lived side by side, the early Nahuatl-speaking peoples who would one day raise cities and rule empires. For generations they fished in clear lakes, tilled generous soil, and lived under the watchful wings of great white herons. But stillness is rarely the fate of those touched by the gods. The calm of Aztlán was broken by a divine command, a voice that rose from the darkness of a cave and rode on the wings of a hummingbird. This voice belonged to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south. He was not yet the towering war god of a mighty empire, but a fierce, guiding spirit, a guardian who whispered of a destiny far to the south. He chose one people among the many tribes and gave them a new name. They would leave behind Aztlán, their familiar shores and their old identities. "You shall no longer be called the people of Aztlán," the god declared. "From this moment you are the Mexica." It was an exodus born from faith and driven by the promise of a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. The departure from Aztlán marks the beginning of the migration period, a long and punishing journey that would stretch across generations. Imagine the scene. Thousands of men, women, and children carrying their household gods on their backs, turning away from the only home they had ever known. They abandoned white cranes and emerald waters, trading them for dust, thornbush, and uncertainty. They were not simply migrants, they were pilgrims. Every step taken away from the mythical island was a step toward a prophecy that would one day end in the building of one of the greatest cities on earth. For the Mexica, the story of Aztlán became the foundation of their identity. It gave them a divine origin and a sacred justification for their future conquests. Even at the height of their power, Aztec rulers would send expeditions to the north, searching for this lost paradise, hoping to touch the source of their own bloodline. They never found it. Aztlán remained a mirage in memory, a spectral island reflected in the eyes of every Mexica warrior who stared toward the horizon. It was the beginning of their time, the moment when the sun first rose on a people destined to master the Mexican valley. Yet leaving Aztlán was more than a change of landscape. It began a centuries-long ordeal that would harden and define the Mexica. They traded a land of relative abundance and gentle waters for the harsh expanse of the northern frontiers. Archaeologists and historians call this age the Great Migration. For the Mexica, it was a crucible. The soft-handed fishermen and farmers of the mythical island were slowly reshaped by burning sun, cold nights, and hunger. They became the nomads of destiny, a people always in motion, guided not by maps or roads but by the murmured orders of Huitzilopochtli, carried in a sacred bundle on the backs of his priests. For generations they crossed arid deserts, climbed treacherous mountain passes, and skirted the lands of powerful, settled tribes who looked down on them as unwelcome intruders. The codices remember this era as one of deep hardship. They wore the skins of wild animals, hunted with simple bows and arrows, and survived on what little the land would offer: snakes, small creatures, cactus fruit. Yet this deprivation was seen as a holy trial, a necessary stripping away of weakness. The Mexica were being remade, preparing for an imperial future their ancestors could barely imagine. They were learning the cruel mathematics of survival, lessons that would later shape their unforgiving systems of tribute and conquest. Their journey was not a straight, unbroken march. Often they settled for years, sometimes decades, building temporary temples, planting crops, only to be ordered onward again by their god. Ancient cities like Tula, once the proud capital of the Toltecs, became resting points, places where the Mexica absorbed the faded glories of old kingdoms. They copied architectural forms, borrowed religious ideas, and later would claim this legacy as part of their own noble past. They were cultural sponges, soaking up the wisdom of the lands they crossed, even as they were dismissed as barbarians by the more refined Tolteca they encountered. Their life was framed by conflict. As outsiders, they had to fight for food, for safe passage, sometimes simply for the right to exist. Battle by battle, their warriors were sharpened, until their reputation for ferocity made them useful as mercenaries to greater powers like Azcapotzalco. They sold their skill in war in exchange for scraps of land or temporary protection. It was a bitter role for a people promised glory, serving as the hired blades for others' ambitions. Yet this too was an education, in strategy, in alliances, in the intricate politics of the Valley of Mexico. Through all of this, the promise of Huitzilopochtli held them together. The vision of the eagle and serpent was not just a distant sign, it was proof that suffering carried meaning. They were a chosen people in the wilderness, a pattern that echoes many of humanity's great migration stories. When they finally reached the shimmering lakes of the High Valley, they were no longer the hesitant immigrants of Aztlán. They had become a tightly knit, battle-hardened tribe, fiercely loyal to their god and to one another, carrying a deep hunger for a homeland, and a quiet ambition that would soon shake the foundations of the world they were entering. After generations of wandering, the Mexica stood at last before the Valley of Mexico, a vast basin cradling a chain of glittering lakes. It was a green and living world, already crowded with powerful city-states. To these established powers, the Mexica appeared as they had so many times before: ragged outsiders, fit only for servitude or expulsion. The Mexica were pushed from one temporary settlement to another, despised and persecuted. Finally, shattered by conflicts and hunted by the powerful Tepenecs of Azcapotzalco, they were driven into the only land nobody else desired: the marshy, desolate islands in the western reaches of Lake Texcoco. It was a place of mud, reeds, and clouds of mosquitoes, barely fit for human life. Yet it was here, in the lowest valley of their despair, that destiny stepped out of the mist. The prophecy of Huitzilopochtli had always been exact. They were not to settle until they saw the divine sign. An eagle, sacred bird of the sun, perched upon a prickly pear cactus that sprang from stone, devouring a serpent. This was not some simple riddle to solve. It was a vision of the universe itself. The eagle was the sky and the sun god. The serpent was the earth, fertility, and the underworld. The cactus rising from rock was the axis mundi, the pillar that bound all realms together. To find this trinity was to find the very center of the world. According to the chronicles, in the year we now call 1325 AD, Mexica priests, guided by their visionary leader Tenoch, pushed their canoes into the reedy swamps. There, on a small rocky islet ringed by murky water, they saw what no wanderer dares to expect: a great golden eagle, wings spread against the burning sky, stood upon a blooming nopal cactus. In its beak and talons writhed a serpent, torn and falling in pieces to the water below. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The long migration, the hunger, the humiliation, the generations of exile, all came to a single point. They sank to their knees in the mud, tears mixing with the lake water. Huitzilopochtli had kept his promise. From that moment, the Aztec Empire had its sacred beginning. The place received a name that carried both memory and omen: Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus on the stone. The image is so powerful that it still stands on the flag of modern Mexico. But in that first moment, there was nothing triumphant about the land itself. Their promised ground was almost all swamp. No open fields for crops, no forests for timber, no quarries for stone. To imagine a city there seemed like madness, yet the sign transformed everything. The hostile marsh became consecrated earth. Hardship was no longer a curse. It was a divine test. If they could build here, they could build anywhere. The vision of the eagle and cactus ignited the hidden genius of the Mexica. It demanded that they become engineers, masters of water, and fierce defenders of a fragile island. The wandering nomads had finally found their center. Now they would have to conquer the lake itself to build the throne of the fifth sun. The vision was glorious, but what followed was back-breaking, mud-spattered reality. When the Mexica first stepped into the brackish waters of Lake Texcoco to begin Tenochtitlan, they were not building on firm ground, but on hope balanced over deep water. Their island was a low, swampy patch smothered in reeds and insects. To most peoples, it would have been a place of exile or death. To the Mexica, it was a blank canvas for a miracle. They began by driving long, sharpened wooden stakes into the soft lake bed, forcing them deep into ancient layers of silt to create a skeleton of support. Upon this, they raised their first shrines and homes. Not the massive stone pyramids of later centuries, but modest structures of mud and thatch, clustered together like birds' nests in the middle of an endless water maze. The founding of the city was a ritual as much as a work of engineering. The island was divided into 4 great sectors, mirroring the Aztec vision of a 4-cornered universe. At the exact center lay the sacred precinct, the future site of the great temple, the beating heart where sky, earth, and underworld touched. Every canal, every street, every future temple would spread outward from this holy core. In these first years, life was a daily struggle against rising waters and encroaching swamp. The Mexica learned the moods of the lake the way others learned the seasons. They became masters of the water, gliding through the labyrinth of channels in slender dugout canoes for centuries to come. These canoes would be the veins of their city, carrying food, people, and messages through a floating world. They were a people born from the lake, and in time, the lake itself would become their greatest shield. The wisdom of choosing an island soon revealed itself. In the fractured, violent politics of the Valley of Mexico, Tenochtitlan was a natural fortress. Any enemy who wished to crush the Mexica would have to cross wide stretches of open water or squeeze along narrow causeways that could be easily cut or defended, while other city-states burned and rebuilt in endless cycles of war. The island city grew quietly behind its shimmering moat, wrapped in the mists of Texcoco. But this protection had its own price. The island had no fresh springs, no forests, no stone. Every beam of wood, every block of rock, every basket of grain had to be ferried across the water by canoe, often bought or bargained for with the very neighbors who still despised them. To survive, the Mexica turned necessity into innovation. They did not simply live on the island, they expanded it. Day after day, they dredged up mud from the lake bottom, piling it into shallow enclosures framed by stakes and reeds, turning water into earth beneath their feet. From this relentless labor were born the Chinampas, the legendary floating gardens that would one day feed hundreds of thousands. At first, Tenochtitlan was only a fragile sprawl of mud huts and wooden walkways. A city that seemed like it could slip back into the lake at any time. Yet beneath this humble surface, something extraordinary was taking shape. As the decades passed, the memory of ceaseless wandering slowly dulled, replaced by a swelling sense of purpose. The modest shrine of Huitzilopochtli grew again and again, each new layer of stone rising higher, a visible marker of Mexica power. They were no longer the unwelcome vagrants of the valley. They were becoming the designers of an impossible dream. The founding of Tenochtitlan was the moment the Mexica stopped fleeing and began to command. It was an act of defiance against the landscape itself, and against every neighbor who had once pushed them aside. From mud and reeds, a vision of stone and gold was emerging, a city that would one day blaze so brightly upon the lake that even hardened Spanish conquistadors would stand speechless before it. Yet the survival of Tenochtitlan rested on a knife edge between abundance and scarcity. The city floated in the middle of an immense lake, but the water around it was brackish and deadly to drink. As the population soared into the tens of thousands and then more, thirst became a constant, looming threat. At first, the Mexica relied on scattered springs and on tireless water carriers, paddling from the mainland in heavy canoes. But as their island of huts hardened into a metropolis of stone, the demand for fresh water outgrew the strength of any fleet of paddlers to keep their growing empire from drying out. The Aztecs had to master water on a level that would rival the aqueducts of distant Rome. The answer lay 3 miles to the west, at the feet of a wooded hill known as Chapultepec, the hill of the grasshopper. Here, cold, clear springs flowed from the earth in steady abundance. To bring this liquid lifeblood across miles of marsh and salt water to an island city required a staggering feat of imagination and engineering. Work on the Chapultepec aqueduct began under the rule of Montezuma I, but its true brilliance unfolded in partnership with Nezahualcóyotl, the philosopher king of Texcoco. Nezahualcóyotl was more than a poet of sorrow and beauty. He was an architect of water, a man who understood the secret balances of flow and pressure. Under their guidance, stone and wood were shaped into graceful channels that carried fresh water over the lake to Tenochtitlan, binding city and shore together with a shining ribbon of moving light. The aqueduct was not a simple pipe, but a sophisticated, double-veined channel laid carefully along a massive causeway. 2 parallel stone corridors ran side by side, each wide enough for a person to walk through if needed. Their true brilliance lay in how they worked together. Only one of these channels flowed at any given time, carrying fresh spring water straight into the heart of the city, while the other rested, was cleaned or repaired. In this way, Tenochtitlan was never left thirsty, not for a day, not even for an hour. The channels were tilted with almost obsessive precision. Their slope was gentle enough that gravity alone could pull the water over miles of uneven ground, yet never so steep that the flow would break the stonework. It was like a steady pulse, a stone artery beating with clear water, sending life rhythmically into the body of the city. Once the water reached Tenochtitlan, it spread into a finer web of small canals and public fountains. The royal palaces received their share, feeding lush gardens, pools, and private baths, But the water did not belong to nobles alone. It ran toward the great markets, washed the streets, and filled the basins used by ordinary families. The Mexica were almost obsessive about cleanliness, a habit that would later shock the Europeans who stepped onto their causeways, while distant capitals across the ocean choked on filth and disease. The people of the lake bathed often, washed their clothes, and used water in a ritual rhythm that kept plagues at bay. So the aqueduct was not just a clever device, it was a visible sign of the Tlatelolco's power, proof that the speaker could bend the elements to the needs of his people. To command water was to command life itself, and in the eyes of the Mexica, that meant ruling with the favor of the gods of the sun and rain. But their mastery of water did not end with the aqueduct. The same springs that fed the city needed protection from the wild moods of Lake Texcoco. During the rainy season, storms could drive salty, foaming water inland, threatening to contaminate the canals and fields. In answer to this danger, Quetzalcoatl conceived another immense project. A dike 10 miles long, the Albarradón de Quetzalcoatl, built from timber, stone, and packed earth. This barrier cut through the lake like a patient, controlling hand. It held back the brackish waters, kept the fresh side clean, and tamed the floods that had once swallowed the early city. Together, the dikes and aqueducts turned the valley's chaos into a kind of artificial order, a vast, carefully controlled basin in which Tenochtitlan stood as the engineered heart. The Mexica had proved that they were more than inhabitants of the lake. They were its masters, and with clean water now secured, the empire could spread its influence far beyond the ring of mountains that framed the Mexican plateau. Yet as the aqueducts soothed the city's thirst, another fear grew in the shadows: hunger. The island of stone and reeds sat in the middle of a lake whose water could not be drunk, and more critically, whose surface offered almost no natural farmland. The surrounding shores were already divided among rival powers, and the tribute from early conquests was not nearly enough to feed the swelling crowds of commoners, artisans, and warriors. The Mexica found themselves trapped by their own success. Their numbers rose, but the land did not. They stood on the edge of a quiet disaster. To survive, they could not simply claim more fields. They had to create them from nothing. They would have to turn the shallow, sucking swamp around them into a machine of abundance. From this need emerged one of the greatest agricultural inventions of the pre-modern world: the Chinampas, often called floating gardens. Though they did not float at all, they were anchored islands of almost impossible fertility, lifted by human hands from the dark mud of the lake bed. The making of a Chinampa was grueling, wet work, a kind of half-drowned construction that demanded many hands working in step. In a shallow stretch of the lake, workers first marked out a long, narrow rectangle, perhaps 30 feet wide and 300 feet in length. Using heavy wooden stakes, they drove poles deep into the lake bottom at the corners and along the sides. Between these posts, they wove tight walls of reeds and branches, forming a submerged basket waiting to be filled. Then the real labor began, with simple tools and bare fingers. They dredged up thick, black mud from the surrounding canals, scooping decaying plants and rich silt from the depths. They heaped this living soil inside the woven frame, layer upon layer, mixing it with cut vegetation, patiently raising the mass above the surface of the water. When at last the new island broke into the air, they planted fast-growing ahujote willows along its edges. Their roots reached down like fingers into the lake bed, binding mud and stake together, turning the fragile platform into a solid, living structure that would not wash away. The result was an agricultural miracle. Surrounded by water, the soil of a Chinampa stayed gently moist at all times, fed from below by slow, steady capillary action. There was no need to pray for rain. The constant dredging of the canals to keep them clear provided endless fresh fertilizer, rich with nutrients. Where a typical field on dry land might yield 1 or 2 harvests a year, a well-kept Chinampa could produce as many as 7. Maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers grew side by side with tomatoes, amaranth, and rows of bright flowers for temples and festivals. The lake around Tenochtitlan slowly transformed into a shimmering chessboard of green rectangular islands, cut by an intricate maze of narrow canals. Before dawn each morning, low, flat-bottomed canoes slid silently between these emerald strips of earth. Farmers moved like shadows among the rows, practicing careful crop rotations, raising seedlings in beds before moving them to the main plots, techniques that would not appear in Europe for centuries. By mid-morning, the same canoes were piled high with vegetables, grains, and flowers, riding so low in the water that their rims kissed the surface. They glided toward the vast market of Tlatelolco, where the lifeblood of the empire was traded, weighed, and eaten. The Chinampa system became the beating stomach of the Aztec state. It produced such a surplus of food that countless hands could be freed from farming, to become soldiers, priests, stonecutters, scribes, and officials, all serving the growing machinery of empire. Yet the Chinampas were more than a clever solution to hunger. They were a declaration of how the Mexica chose to live with their world. They did not simply cover nature in stone and call it progress. They listened to the habits of water and mud, then bent those habits gently to their will, out of swamp and decay. They built a sustainable, self-renewing landscape. When the Spanish finally arrived, they stared in disbelief at a city that seemed to float on water and greenery, a place that by all ordinary logic should never have existed, yet fed hundreds of thousands with ease. For nearly a century, though, the Mexica remained a hidden power, feared as warriors but politically subordinate. They served as mercenaries for the Tepic lords of Azcapotzalco, paying heavy tribute even as their own city rose from the lake. They had water, they had food, they had a growing city of stone. But they did not yet have freedom. That final transformation from subjects to rulers would begin with a death, a cruel new king, and a decision that would change the history of the valley forever. Across the lake, in the city of Texcoco, another story of suffering was unfolding under Maxtla's cruel shadow. There, the rightful prince Huitzilopochtli, the philosopher-poet who had helped shape the aqueducts and dikes, was hiding in the mountains. His father had been murdered before his eyes by Tepic assassins, his kingdom dragged under Tepic rule, in hidden chambers and whispered meetings. Quetzalcoatl and his tireless advisor Tlaloc reached out to this exiled mind. Together with the smaller city-state of Tlacopan, they wove an alliance in secret, a quiet thread that would soon pull down an empire. This was the birth of the Triple Alliance, a brotherhood of states that changed the fate of the valley. Each brought a different strength. From Tenochtitlan came the relentless military power of the Mexica. From Texcoco, the intellectual brilliance and engineering genius of Huitzilopochtli. From Tlacopan, a strategic foothold and vital support on the western shore. Together they formed a single will, dedicated to tearing down Tepic dominance and ending Maxtla's terror. The war that followed was like a storm breaking over the basin. The armies of the alliance closed in on Azcapotzalco in 1428. Their siege was long and ruthless, obsidian blades clashing, feathered shields splintering. The Mexica fought with a burning religious fervor, believing that every enemy struck down was an offering to Huitzilopochtli, the sun-driven war god who had brought them from Aztlán. At last, Azcapotzalco fell. Maxtla was hunted and destroyed, and the once towering Tepic power crumbled into memory. But for the Mexica, victory on the battlefield was only half the transformation. To truly reshape the world, Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc turned to something even more radical. They ordered the burning of the ancient codices. The old painted books that recorded the histories of many peoples were consigned to the flames. In their place, a new story would be told, one in which the Mexica were not wandering latecomers, but rightful heirs of the Toltecs, chosen children of the gods, guardians of the fifth sun. The Triple Alliance turned Tenochtitlan from a rising city-state into the beating heart of an empire. Tribute from conquered towns and cities now flowed like rivers of maize, cotton, jade, and cacao, divided among the three allied powers, with Tenochtitlan and Texcoco taking the greatest share. Yet this new order was more than economic or military. Tlaloc reshaped the very soul of Aztec belief, lifting Huitzilopochtli to the highest throne of the pantheon, and tying the survival of the sun itself to the success of war. From this moment forward, every campaign was more than conquest. It was a holy duty. The empire of the fifth sun was born, and its shadow began to stretch outward over mountains, valleys, and distant coasts. At the summit of this expanding world, seated on a throne of woven reeds in a palace of cool stone and shimmering mosaics, sat the most powerful person in the western half of the earth, the Huitzilopochtli, the great speaker. The title itself reveals much. To rule was to speak, and to speak was to shape reality. The Tlatelolco was not simply a king in the way distant Europeans understood the word. He was a sacred bridge between worlds, half man, half divine herald, the living mouth through which the gods addressed the people, commander of armies, highest judge, guardian of cosmic order. His path to the reed throne was not decided by simple birthright. Instead, a council of 4 great nobles and veteran generals chose from among the royal bloodline, seeking not just lineage but excellence. A future Tlatelolco had to be a proven warrior, someone who had captured high-ranking enemies in battle. Yet he also had to be a master of flowery speech, that refined, poetic rhetoric needed to calm allies, intimidate rivals, and honor the gods. When one man was finally chosen, his transformation into God-King began with hardship, not luxury. In the incense-filled darkness of the great temple, he fasted for 4 days, opened his own skin with obsidian blades to offer blood to the gods, and sank into deep meditation, reminding himself that he was no longer only a man, but the living stand-in of Huitzilopochtli upon the earth. Only after this ordeal did he emerge into the light, crowned in turquoise and wrapped in robes that shimmered with Quetzal feathers. From that moment on, he was no longer simply an individual. He was the state itself, a vessel through which divine will moved. His daily life inside Tenochtitlan was wrapped in ritualized distance. His palace stretched like a city within the city, with gardens, fountains, aviaries, and a private zoo. He walked only on woven mats and soft cloths so that his feet never met bare earth. He was served by thousands. Yet he ate alone behind a decorated screen, for the act of the god-king taking food was too sacred for common eyes. Even the highest nobles approached him barefoot, heads bowed, in simple cloaks. Every gesture, every silence, reinforced the shimmering barrier between ordinary humans and the one who carried the sun on his shoulders. Yet his power was not a hollow show. The Tlatelolco's judgments in court were final, his word in war absolute. He rode to battle at the head of Jaguar and Eagle warriors, his presence a living banner that steadied the lines. And beyond all this, he carried the heaviest burden of all. He was protector of the sun. If he failed in his rituals and duties, it was feared that the sun would falter, the sky would darken, and the fifth sun would end in eternal night. Beneath the shadow of the great temple, this immense responsibility flowed downward into a carefully ordered society, a world where every person's place was fixed like a stone in a pyramid. At the top stood the Pippleton, the noble class, priests, scholars, generals, and officials who traced their ancestry back to the Toltec kings and the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. Below them moved the countless Huitzilopochtli, the commoners whose labor and courage held the empire together. To walk through the streets of Tenochtitlan was to read this invisible order in cloth and color, in the height of sandals, in the words one was permitted or forbidden to speak. From birth, your path in the Aztec world would have been traced like a line in the stars if you were born among the Pipiltin, the noble families who claimed descent from ancient Toltec kings and even the gods themselves. Your life would have unfolded behind temple walls and palace courtyards, while common children learned the weight of hoes and baskets. You would have been led to the Calmecac, a rigorous, almost monastic school of stone corridors and incense-laden halls. There you would study the slow turning of the stars, the intricate knots of the sacred calendar, the old songs that carried the memory of empires. You would learn to lead with an iron hand and a tongue made of poetry, clothed in soft cotton, adorned with gold and jade that glowed like captured sunlight. But privilege was wrapped in pressure. A noble's mistakes were not forgiven lightly. To fail in duty, to show cowardice in battle, was to betray the divine essence of your blood, and the punishment for such betrayal was harsher than anything a commoner might face. Below this shining surface lived the Huitzilopochtli, the countless commoners who formed the true body of the empire. If you walked among them, you would see farmers tending the emerald Chinampas, bending over canals that mirrored the sky, artisans shaping obsidian into blades so sharp they could shave the dawn, porters carrying tribute along the causeways. Backs bowed but spirits unbroken. They lived in Calpoli, great clan houses that were both neighborhood and family, managing shared land and local temples. For a Huitzilopochtli, life followed a gentle rhythm of labor and ritual, of planting and harvest, of household duties and festival days. Their homes were modest, walls of wattle and daub, their clothing simple maguey fiber, by law forbidden to mirror the luxuries of the noble class. Yet they were not trapped at the bottom forever. The Aztec world held open a narrow but powerful door, the path of the warrior, a commoner who proved exceptional courage, capturing multiple high-status enemies on the battlefield, could rise to become an eagle or jaguar knight, earn land, titles, even the right to share food at the Tlatelolco's own table. In this way, war became both a crucible and a ladder, melting away some of the barriers of birth. At the base of the social pyramid were the Tlalocan, those who lived for a time in the shadow of servitude. But even here, the Aztec way was different from many other worlds. Slavery was rarely a permanent chain. A man crushed by gambling debts might sell himself into service to save his family. A criminal might be sentenced to labor for those he had harmed. Yet the Tlalocan still retained their humanity. They could own property, marry, raise children who were born free. Their condition was a passing eclipse of freedom, not an endless night. All of this intricate order was visible in the smallest details. Sumptuary laws turned clothing into a language. To wear cotton was to declare power. To wear maguey was to acknowledge service. In the great palace, a commoner who failed to remove his sandals or forgot to cast down his eyes before a noble could be executed swiftly, not out of mindless cruelty, but as a grim act of balance. For the Mexica believed that the universe itself depended on every being holding to their proper place. The Pipiltin provided vision and spiritual protection. The Huitzilopochtli provided strength and sustenance. Together, they had turned a swamp into a sanctuary, a wandering tribe into the masters of the Mexican world. If the great temple was the spiritual heart of this universe, then the market of Tlatelolco was its pulsing economic soul. To step into that vast plaza, perhaps as you drift now in your imagination, was to feel the full breath of the Aztec Empire. Every day, as many as 60,000 people flowed through its ordered lanes. A soft roar of voices rose like distant surf. Merchants, farmers, artisans, all moving through a carefully planned maze of stalls. Each row had its purpose. Textiles here, food there, precious stones and metals in another quarter. Nothing was random, and yet everything was alive. Your senses would be overwhelmed. Rainbows of cloth stacked in bright mounds. The earthy sweet smell of cacao beans, both drink and currency, hanging in the air. Gold ornaments catching the sun. Turquoise and jade glowing deep green. Obsidian knives gleaming with a lethal shine. Feather mosaics flashing blues and greens from faraway tropical forests. Around you, piles of maize and beans. Bundles of firewood, baskets of tomatoes and chili peppers, trays of iguana meat, dried fish from distant coasts, honey from jungle hives. Order ruled even here. A council of 12 judges sat in a central building, ready to settle disputes or punish deceit. Prices followed an unwritten yet precise logic of supply and demand. Sweepers moved constantly, keeping the plaza clean, reflecting the Aztec love of Tlatelolco, wisdom, order, and right conduct. At the center of this web moved the Pachteca, the elite merchant guild. They traveled far beyond the valley with long caravans, carrying obsidian, textiles, and crafted goods, returning with jaguar skins, quetzal feathers, rare resins, tropical fruits, and secrets. For they were not only traders, but the hidden eyes and ears of the Tlatelolco, quietly gathering news of distant lands and restless provinces. Their safe return to Tlatelolco, canoes heavy with treasures, was a sign that the heart of the empire still beat strongly, that the fifth sun still moved across the sky, powered not only by war and sacrifice, but by the peaceful, intricate dance of trade and shared labor. And beneath it all, wealth itself remained something living, not cold metal locked away, but beans, cloth, salt, things grown, woven, carried by human hands. A reminder that even in the greatest of empires, every treasure began as a seed in the earth, or a thread between fingers in the quiet of dawn. This gave rise to two primary forms of currency that quietly powered the markets and financed the state: the precious cacao bean and the finely woven cotton cloak known as Quetzalcoatl. To understand Aztec currency was to step into a world where value was tangible and sensory, where wealth could be tasted, worn, and held in the hands, and where every unit of money was tied to the visible gifts of the gods. Cacao was the gold of the earth. These small, bitter seeds were far more than ingredients for a sacred drink. They were the small change of the empire. Legend told that Quetzalcoatl himself had stolen the cacao tree from the realm of the gods to give it to humanity, turning each bean into a divine token, because cacao could only grow in the humid tropical lowlands. Every bean that reached the high valley of Mexico had been carried for hundreds of miles by human porters, absorbing along the way the value of distance and effort. In the markets of Tlatelolco, a few beans could purchase a tomato, a tamale, or a handful of salt. Larger handfuls could buy a turkey, a fine obsidian blade, or a bundle of good firewood. The Aztecs were so meticulous about this currency that they even faced the familiar problem of counterfeiting. Some dishonest traders hollowed out the shells of cacao beans and filled them with mud or sand, mimicking the weight of a full, precious seed. For larger transactions, the purchase of land, the ransom of a captive, the payment of heavy imperial tribute, cacao alone was not enough. For these dealings, they turned to Quetzalcoatl, standardized lengths of white cotton cloth woven with exquisite care. A single Quetzalcoatl was a significant store of value, often equal to the labor needed to sustain a commoner for several months. A high-quality cloak could be worth 100, 200, even 300 cacao beans, depending on its weave and decoration. A person's status could often be read directly from their shoulders, in the number and fineness of the cloaks they possessed. This textile currency created a unique economic tension within households, for it was women who were the primary weavers. Their patient work at the backstrap loom became the living mint of the empire's highest denomination, every thread a strand of national wealth. Beyond cacao and cotton, more specialized forms of currency served the elite. Transparent quills filled with gold dust provided a way to carry immense value in delicate tubes. Copper axes cast into distinctive T-shapes and thinned, until useless as tools functioned as symbolic money in certain regions. Yet unlike much of the modern world's wealth, Aztec money almost always had inherent, practical use. Cacao could be drunk, cotton could be worn. There was no notion of hoarding invisible numbers in ledgers. Wealth was meant to be consumed, displayed, and redistributed in ritual, feasting, and tribute. This organic monetary system kept the economy tethered tightly to the physical reality of land and labor. When the Spanish first saw Aztecs trading beans for cloth, they dismissed it as primitive, their eyes fixed only on gold and silver. They failed to see the quiet stability of a system where money itself decayed, because cacao rotted and cloth eventually frayed. There were natural limits on endless accumulation. Wealth had to move, to circulate, mirroring an Aztec universe in which motion was essential to existence. In the counting of beans and the measuring of cloth, they were not just operating a market. They were maintaining the fragile balance of a world where value was as fleeting and precious as life itself. In this world, food too was never merely fuel, but a sacred communion, a daily ritual that renewed the bonds between people, land, and gods. Aztec cuisine was a testament to ingenuity in a demanding environment, transforming modest ingredients into a rich culinary tradition. At its core stood two divine pillars: the golden sustenance of maize and the dark, mysterious elixir of chocolate. To truly glimpse the Aztec soul, one had to look not only at their towering pyramids, but at their hearths, where the steady grinding of the metate set the rhythm of life. Maize reigned as undisputed king, the literal flesh of humanity in their creation myths. More than a crop, it was a deity, worshipped as Sentiatl. The Aztecs cultivated dozens of varieties, each suited to a different altitude or soil, but their true brilliance revealed itself in nixtamalization, the process of boiling dried kernels in water mixed with limestone ash. This simple act softened the hull, released vital nutrients such as niacin, and quietly prevented the scourge of malnutrition. The treated corn was then ground on volcanic stone metates into masa, the dough from which they shaped tortillas, tamales, and the thick, warming drink known as atl. If maize was daily sustenance, chocolate was concentrated power, the drink of nobles and gods. Known as Xocolatl, bitter water, it shared little with the sweet confections of later centuries. Cacao beans from the lowlands were roasted, shelled, and ground into a fragrant paste on heated stone, mixed with cold water and flavored with chili. Vanilla orchid pods, aromatic ear flower, or honey. The liquid was poured back and forth between vessels from a height to raise a thick foam, the most prized part of the drink. Xocolatl was reserved for the elite, sipped from painted ceramic cups at the close of great feasts. It was believed to banish fatigue, sharpen the mind, and inflame desire. Chroniclers later claimed that Montezuma II drank dozens of golden cups a day, especially before visiting his harem. For the Aztecs, to drink chocolate was to draw divine energy into the body, to swallow a measure of the same power that moved the sun. Beyond maize and chocolate, their pantry stretched wide. In a world without cattle or pigs, meat came from turkeys, ducks, small hairless dogs, and the living waters of the lake fish. Frogs, insects, and spirulina algae formed into nourishing cakes. Their tables held squash, beans, tomatoes, avocados, sweet potatoes, and chilies of every color and intensity. It was a cuisine of bold flavors, complex textures, and deep reverence for the earth's generosity. Every tortilla carried the presence of a god. Every cup of chocolate glittered with the idea of power. Within this same sacred city, close to the towering bulk of the great temple, stood another quieter monument, the Calmecac, the house of lineage, the house of wisdom. While most children of the empire learned the skills of farming and war, a select few, the sons of the Pippleton and a handful of gifted commoners, passed through its stone gates into a world of strict discipline, ancient knowledge, and demanding spiritual instruction. The Calmecac was far more than a school in the modern sense. It was a sacred monastery, a forge designed to burn away the softness of childhood and shape the future leaders, high priests, and scholars of the empire. To enter the Calmecac was to surrender one's life to the service of the gods and the state, embarking on a journey where the mastery of the mind was considered as vital as the strength of the sword. Life within those stone walls moved to the rhythm of ritualized asceticism. Young students, arriving as early as age 10, were stripped of their luxuries and forced to live in perpetual penance. They slept on hard reed mats in cold, unheated rooms. Their days began long before dawn, awakened by the slow, steady beating of wooden drums in the darkness. Their tasks were humble and exhausting, sweeping temple floors, gathering firewood from distant mountains, performing grueling physical labor to maintain the sacred grounds. But the most profound lessons drifted in during the deepest hours of night. Students were often awakened at midnight, shivering in the cool air, to perform acts of self-sacrifice. With maguey thorns they pierced their ears and limbs, letting drops of blood fall onto obsidian bowls and woven mats as offerings to the gods. This was not seen as punishment, but as necessary purification of the spirit. For a leader, the Aztecs believed, had to be master of his own pain before he could ever hope to master an empire. The curriculum of the Calmecac was a deep immersion in the hidden knowledge of the Mesoamerican world. At its core lay the mastery of the painted books, the codices, under the watchful gaze of the Tlaloc, the wise men. Philosophers and sages, students learned to read the dense pictographs that trace the pathways of the stars, the turns of the sacred 260-day divining calendar, and the steady cycle of the 365-day solar year. They studied the sky with such precision that they could foresee eclipses and rare conjunctions, treating the heavens as a living scroll on which the gods wrote their will. They became guardians of memory, committing to heart long epic poems and historical chants that retold the migrations of their ancestors, the rise and fall of ancient cities, the deeds of legendary kings. In the Calmecac, history was not simply stored on pages, it was carried in voices, recited in slow, hypnotic cadences that stitched the past to the present and kept the story of the Mexica unbroken. Perhaps the most crucial art taught within these walls was rhetoric, the flowery speech. The Aztecs placed immense weight on the spoken word. A true leader had to be an orator of rare refinement, capable of delivering the Huitzilopochtli, the ancient words or moral discourses, with calm authority and poetic grace. These speeches contained the ethical spine of their society and were passed down from elder to youth like sacred heirlooms. Students spent years polishing the sounds and patterns of Nahuatl, learning to weave metaphors and twin poems that could soothe a crowd, move the council of four, or ignite the courage of an army standing at the edge of battle. To speak clumsily was to reveal a fracture in the soul. To speak beautifully was to show the glimmer of divine favor. Graduates of the Calmecac stepped out into the world not merely as educated men, but as living embodiments of the Aztec state. They became architects of grand strategy, judges who interpreted divine and civil law, priests who tended the cosmic machinery and guarded the journey of the sun. The weight of such training was matched only by the severity of their responsibility. A noble shaped by the Calmecac who later faltered in discipline, or committed a serious crime might be punished by death, for his failure was seen as an insult to the very wisdom that had formed him. The Calmecac was the intellectual fortress of Tenochtitlan, the place where the raw ambition of a once nomadic people was refined into the intricate ideology of empire. While warriors conquered land with obsidian and courage, the scholars of the Calmecac conquered time itself, binding the destiny of the fifth sun into a woven fabric of ritual, memory, and thought. While the sons of the nobility moved through the quiet, incense-filled corridors of the Calmecac, the heartbeat of the Aztec military machine was being forged in a different kind of fire. In every calpuli of Tenochtitlan and across the imperial land stood the Tlaloc, the House of Youth. These were the public schools of the Huitzilopochtli, the commoner class. If the Calmecac was a monastery for the mind, the Tlaloc was a barracks for the soul. Here, the restless energy of young men was drawn together, disciplined, and transformed into the lethal force that helped make the Triple Alliance the dominant power of Mesoamerica. Education in the Tlaloc did not unfold in painted books or under star charts, but in the weight of the wooden shield, the balance of the obsidian-edged macuahuitl, and the unyielding expectation of service to the state. Attendance at the Tlaloc was mandatory for all commoner boys, usually beginning around the age of 15. Upon entering, they came under the authority of seasoned warriors called the Tlaloc. These battle-scarred instructors did not teach through softness. They taught through hardship, through sweat and aching limbs, through the constant presence of rank and obedience. The youths lived within the school, sleeping in communal halls, sharing simple meals of maize and beans. Their days formed a relentless cycle of physical labor and martial drills. They dug canals, repaired dikes, and worked the communal fields of the calpuli. In doing so, they maintained the lifelines of the city while building the unbreakable stamina needed for long campaigns and exhausting marches across mountain and plain. Military training lay at the center of their existence. Under the bright, unshielded sun of the high plateau, they practiced until every movement became instinct. They learned the whipping power of the Atlatl, the spear thrower whose darts could pierce armor, the precise curve of the sling stone arcing through the air. They fought in endless mock battles, learning to move together in dense, disciplined formations, like living walls advancing across the field. Yet the most important lesson of the Tlaloc was not how to kill, but how to capture, in the sacred economy of Aztec warfare. A dead enemy was often considered a missed opportunity. The true goal was to take living captives, to feed the altars of the gods and sustain the cosmic order. This demanded a rare combination of strength and control, ferocity and restraint. A kind of surgical violence practiced again and again within the dusty courtyards of the House of Youth. The social structure of the Tlaloc mirrored the Aztec belief in merit carved in blood. While a commoner could never fully join the highest circles of the Pipiltin, the Tlaloc opened a narrow, brilliant path upward, a ladder built from courage on the battlefield. Success in war became the only currency that truly mattered here. When a young warrior captured his first enemy in battle, he was honored in special ceremonies, his hair cut and shaped to mark the change in his status. As he captured more enemies, 2, 3, 4, his life transformed. His clothing grew more elaborate, his meals richer, his standing higher. Eventually, the most successful could be admitted into the prestigious orders of the Jaguar or Eagle Knights, elite warriors whose cloaks and helmets turned them into walking symbols of terror and glory. For a commoner, the Tlaloc was both trial and promise, the place where a boy might, through sheer will and discipline, reshape the arc of his destiny. Yet the Tlaloc was not only about weapons and marching. In the evenings, when the heat of the day faded and stars appeared above the lake, the youths gathered to listen to elder warriors. They heard tales of ancestral battles, of migrations and omens, of the sacred obligation laid upon the Mexica by Huitzilopochtli. They learned obedience, endurance, humility, and absolute loyalty to the Tlaloc. They practiced the songs and dances of the sacred calendar, understanding that they were not just soldiers in an army, but actors in a cosmic drama that stretched from the first dawn of the fifth sun toward an unknown, distant twilight. These young men fought not for personal gain, but for the honor of their Calpuli and for the fragile survival of the sun itself. In their minds, every march, every wound, every shout on the battlefield formed part of a sacred duty. They were the steel of the empire, the living wall of shields that stood between the heart of the Mexico world and the chaos beyond its borders. Their harsh education in the Tlaloc ensured that the Aztec military remained not a collection of reckless fighters, but a professional, disciplined, and deeply devoted force. One that neighboring states learned to fear long before a single spear was thrown. At the very summit of this martial hierarchy stood two radiant and terrifying orders of warriors, whose appearance alone could make enemy lines waver. These were the Eagle Knights and the Jaguar Knights. They were not simply elite soldiers in the service of a king. They were the personification of the empire's predatory spirit, the living images of the blazing sun and the stalking night, in a society bound by intricate social layers. These orders were the clearest expression of Aztec meritocracy. Men of both noble and common birth stood side by side in their ranks, united by one shared measure of worth, the number of high-status enemies they had captured alive for sacrifice. To wear the spotted skin of the jaguar or the iridescent feathers of the eagle was to step beyond ordinary humanity, to become, in the eyes of the people, a semi-divine instrument of the state. Their very appearance served as a weapon of the mind. The Jaguar Knights were linked to the deep night, to the unseen spaces of the underworld, and to Tezcatlipoca, the many-faced god of destiny and smoke. They clothed themselves in full jaguar pelts, hunted specifically for this sacred purpose. Their own faces emerged from gaping feline jaws, as if they had been swallowed and reborn as predators, masters of stealth and ambush. They slipped through lakeside reeds and mountain passes with the quiet, deliberate power of real jaguars, their quilted cotton armor, soaked in salt water until it hardened, absorbed and turned aside the obsidian blades of their foes. Facing them across the cosmic balance were the Eagle Knights, champions of the sunlit sky, servants of Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the rising day. They wore brilliant feathered costumes that shimmered in the light, and helmets shaped into the curved, predatory beaks of raptors. On the battlefield, they were the shock of noon-made flesh, storming forward with the sudden, crushing force of an eagle diving from the heavens. Their shields glowed with intricate feather mosaics, flashing in the sun until the very air around them seemed to waver, turning their advance into a dazzling spectacle meant to unsettle and overwhelm enemy ranks. Admission into these orders was a trial of years, not moments. It required a consistent record of extraordinary courage across multiple campaigns. Above all, a candidate had to capture at least 4 high-ranking enemy warriors in open battle, a requirement that demanded far more than rage or strength alone. To seize a fully armed opponent alive, without ending his life, called for discipline, timing, and a kind of controlled ferocity that few could master. Those who succeeded were rewarded with privileges that ordinary citizens could scarcely imagine. The Jaguar and Eagle Knights were allowed to wear fine cotton and rich jewelry, to take concubines, and to dine in the reserved halls of the royal palace, in the presence of the great speaker himself. They were among the very few permitted to keep their sandals on, a small gesture, but one that quietly lifted them above the common dust of the earth. On the field of war, these animal warriors formed the sharp tip of the imperial spear, deployed at key moments. They struck where morale was weakest or where enemy commanders stood directing the fight. Their primary work was not indiscriminate slaughter, but the precise capture of high-value prisoners. They fought with the Aqueducts, a wooden sword edged with volcanic glass. Capable, so the stunned Spaniards would later report, of decapitating a horse in a single blow. The sight of hundreds of Jaguar and Eagle Knights charging through smoke and dust, their pelts and feathers rippling, their battle cries echoing off hillsides, often broke enemy courage before the first ranks even clashed. They were the iron fist of the Triple Alliance, the leading cause of its swift expansion across the continent. Yet their purpose reached beyond human politics. For the Aztecs, these warriors were the custodians of the cosmos, the ones responsible for feeding the sun itself. The captives they dragged from the chaos of battle were not trophies, but offerings, the sacred nourishment that kept the fifth sun moving across the sky. In this way, Jaguar and Eagle Knights became high priests of ritualized violence. Every blow they struck was a kind of prayer. Every victory, a brief postponement of the darkness that always threatened to return. Their legacy was etched into the memory of their people, written in blood on temple steps, and in the gold and feathers that adorned their triumphs. They stood as the ultimate expression of the Aztec belief that life and death were woven together, and that only through sacrifice could the fragile order of the universe endure. Within the hands of such warriors, the Aqueducts took on a meaning far deeper than that of a simple weapon. It was a sacred instrument of destiny, crafted not for mindless killing, but for the complex ritual of warfare in which the highest aim was the capture of a living soul. European observers often mistook it for a crude club, yet in truth, it was a remarkable feat of material engineering, a union of wood and volcanic glass that could rival the cutting power of the finest steel blades of the Old World. Its design rose directly from the geology of the Mexican plateau, where metal ores were scarce. But obsidian lay in abundance. This volcanic glass, when fractured, formed edges sharper than modern surgical steel. The core of the Aqueduct was carved from dense, resilient hardwood, such as oak or zappo, shaped into a broad, flat form around 3 to 4 feet long. The handle was carefully grooved for a firm grip. Along the sides of this wooden body, artisans carved deep parallel channels. Into these they fitted rectangular blades of prismatic obsidian, each one flaked with meticulous care, then set in place using sticky natural resins mixed with substances like turtle dung and bat guano. The finished weapon resembled a heavy paddle lined with black, glittering teeth. So terrifying was its edge that Spanish conquistadors later recalled, with visible unease, how a single, well-aimed swing could sever a horse's head, yet sheer cutting power was only part of its brilliance. The Aqueduct was built for the two-stage dance of Aztec combat. In the first chaotic clash of armies, it functioned as a crushing club. The flat wooden sides delivered staggering blows, breaking bones, stunning opponents, or dropping them to their knees without necessarily ending their lives. This was vital, for a dead enemy could not climb the temple steps as an offering, once an opponent was reeling. The warrior shifted his grip, bringing the obsidian edge into play with careful, controlled strikes. He could slice tendons in arms or legs, disable rather than destroy, and render the foe helpless for capture. In this way, the Aqueduct perfectly reflected Aztec warfare itself. A balance of ferocity and restraint, of violence used not as an end, but as a pathway to sacrifice, and to the continued turning of the fifth sun across the sky. The Aqueduct was therefore a tool of both brute force and careful disablement. Its very limitations shaped the way the Aztecs waged war. Obsidian, for all its incredible sharpness, was also fragile. It could splinter on contact with stone, or shatter against the hard plates of Spanish steel armor. This meant that a warrior could not simply swing wildly and hope for the best. Every strike had to be measured, precise, aimed at the exposed places where flesh lay unprotected: the neck, the limbs, the face. This necessity cultivated a style of combat that was intensely personal and highly skilled. Battles were not just crashing masses of men, but countless individual duels, each one a contest of reflexes, judgment, and courage. Such warfare aligned perfectly with the meritocratic spirit of the Aztec military orders. The Aqueducts demanded that a warrior be fast, agile, and fiercely intelligent. It rewarded those who could think as quickly as they could strike. On the battlefield, the psychological effect of this weapon was immense. Thousands of warriors advanced with Aqueducts in hand, the obsidian blades catching the light and flashing like jagged black lightning. The sound of those edges biting into bone and flesh carried across the field, a sickening crunch that froze the hearts of those who heard it. To the enemies of the Triple Alliance, the Aqueducts became a symbol of terror. For the Spanish, it was a weapon that defied expectation. It looked primitive, carved from wood and stone, yet it inflicted wounds so deep and clean that their surgeons struggled to repair them. In time, the Aqueducts came to stand as a symbol of Aztec martial identity itself, a weapon drawn from the volcanic heart of their land, crafted to feed the gods with the blood of the brave. High on the thin air of the Mexican plateau, war was not always driven by territory, tribute, or simple hatred. Sometimes it followed a different logic, a solemn choreography of risk and devotion, a sacred dance whose steps had been agreed upon in advance. This was the Tlatelolco, the Flowery War, a form of conflict that seemed to contradict ordinary ideas of empire and conquest. Though the armies of the Triple Alliance could crush many neighboring states by sheer force, they chose in some cases to maintain a controlled, perpetual tension instead. They entered into ritualized wars with certain rivals, most famously the Tlaxcalans. These were not chaotic clashes born of desperation, but structured encounters driven by mutual religious obligation. The battlefield in such times resembled a vast open-air temple, its rituals performed with blood and obsidian rather than incense alone. The origins of the Flowery Wars lay in the memory of famine. In the mid-15th century, the Valley of Mexico suffered a series of devastating shortages. Crops failed, people starved, and the priests of the Triple Alliance searched the heavens and the codices for answers. They concluded that the gods, especially Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god, were themselves starving. To prevent the collapse of the cosmos, a steady supply of worthy sacrificial victims was needed. Brave warriors captured in honest combat, not helpless peasants taken from the fields. From this grim logic emerged an agreement. Certain city-states would meet on chosen plains at appointed times, not to annihilate each other, but to offer and receive captives. Long-range weapons such as bows and atlatls were sometimes limited or set aside, forcing combat into close quarters, where the obsidian blade and the warrior's skill decided fates. The rules of these wars were known to both sides, and within that shared understanding, the violence unfolded like a dark ceremony for an Aztec warrior. The Flowery War represented the purest test of valor and technique, because the goal was to capture rather than kill. Combat became an exhausting contest of stamina, balance, and restraint. Warriors aimed for tendons and joints, for disabling strikes that toppled opponents without ending their lives. Every successful capture enhanced personal honor, opened doors to elite orders, and was seen as a direct offering to the gods. To be captured in such a war was not the same as being seized in a rout or ambush. For many, it marked the beginning of a sacred journey. The captive became a living message, a gift carried upward to the divine realm. His heart and blood were offered so that his people, and even his former enemies, might continue under the watching sun. The atmosphere of these ritual battles blended beauty with terror. Warriors marched onto the field in their most splendid attire, cloaked in vibrant feathers and painted with symbolic designs. Banners fluttered like living flames in the wind, drums thundered, conch shells sounded, and incense curled upward in white streams before the fighting even began. It was as if the entire plain had become a ceremonial courtyard, stretched out beneath the open sky. Beneath the pageantry, however, the reality was unrelenting. The Flowery Wars kept the military elites of the valley honed and ready, their bodies hardened, their reflexes sharpened. By the most dangerous practice imaginable, real battle against equally skilled foes, the system nourished the gods, reinforced social hierarchies, and preserved the fearsome prestige of the Aztec state. In the end, these ritualized conflicts stood as one of the clearest expressions of the Aztec worldview, a belief that the universe was delicate, always at risk of falling into darkness, and that only sacrifice and human effort could keep it in motion. War itself became a form of worship, its horrors woven into the sacred fabric of existence. A flower, in this world, was more than a blossom. It was a metaphor for the heart of a warrior, plucked in its moment of greatest beauty to nourish the divine and keep the fifth sun burning above the lands of the Mexica. In such a universe, even time did not move in a straight line. For the Aztecs, time was a complex machine of interlocking circles, a divine engine whose turning governed the fates of gods and humans alike. At its center stood the Tlatelolco, the counting of the days, a sacred 260-day almanac that reached far beyond the role of a simple calendar. It was a map of destiny. In this system, no day was ordinary. Every moment carried a particular weight. A distinct flavor of cosmic energy ruled by specific gods. The Tlatelolco emerged from the interplay of two cycles. One consisted of 20-day signs: crocodile, wind, house, lizard, serpent, death, deer, rabbit, water, dog, monkey, grass, reed, jaguar, eagle, vulture, earthquake, flint, rain, and flower. The other was a simple numerical sequence from 1 to 13. As these two cycles turned together, they created a unique combination for each day, such as 1 crocodile, 2 wind, 3 house, and so on. Only after all 260 combinations were exhausted would the pattern begin again. This span of 260 days was thought to reflect the hidden rhythm of human gestation, mirroring the time a child spent unseen in the womb, linking the flow of time to the pulse of life itself. Each of the 20 signs was tied to a direction and a patron deity. Each of the 13 numbers carried its own power as well. Together, they formed an intricate tapestry of possibilities. Some days leaned toward conflict, others toward healing. Some favored beginnings, others demanded caution and humility. The keepers of this system were the Tlatelolco, specialists in sacred counting, soothsayers and diviners. They were consulted at every critical turning point in life. When a child entered the world, the parents would seek out these readers of destiny, asking what sort of path lay hidden within the sign and number of the birthday. A child born under a sign associated with art and beauty might be guided toward craft and song. Another born under Jaguar or Flint might be destined for the battlefield. These readings were not absolute decrees, but descriptions of tendencies, strengths, and trials. A skilled Tlatelolco could advise how to soften a difficult fate or how to harness a favorable one. The same sacred count directed the timing of marriages, the planting of crops, the declaration of war, and the performance of major rituals. To act in harmony with the Tlatelolco was to move with the current of the cosmos. To ignore it was to set oneself against the deep, invisible tides of the universe, risking misfortune, failure, an imbalance in a world already poised delicately between creation and collapse. The sacred count of days did not move alone. It flowed beside another great rhythm. The 365-day solar calendar known as the Tlatelolco. This was the measure that guided your fields and forests, the turning of the seasons and the 18 monthly festivals that shaped the year of the empire, where the Tlatelolco mapped destiny and unseen energies. The Tlatelolco mapped rain, seed, growth, and harvest together. These two calendars intertwined like gears in a vast cosmic machine. Their cycles combined to form a great 52-year period, a sacred century in Aztec reckoning. As that 52-year span drew to a close, your world grew tense. Priests watched the skies. People whispered in the markets, for it was believed that at the end of such a cycle, the universe stood on a knife's edge, vulnerable to collapse and eternal darkness. This anxiety reached its peak in the new fire ceremony, a terrifying and awe-filled ritual held once every 52 years. On that night, every hearth in the empire was extinguished, plunging cities and villages alike into utter darkness. You can imagine yourself standing in Tenochtitlan, the lake and causeways swallowed by shadow. Only the shapes of temples faintly visible against the stars, far away, on a sacred hill. Priests watched the heavens for a specific constellation to cross the zenith at the appointed moment. They opened the chest of a sacrificial victim and kindled a new fire within the cavity of his body. If the flame caught and rose into the night, it meant the gods had accepted the offering, that the sun would rise once more. Runners carried this new fire back to every corner of the empire, relighting hearths, temples, and towers, and with each spark, the people breathed again. Through all of this, the Tlatelolco beat like a hidden heart, reminding you that your world was not random, but carefully ordered. Human lives were threads in a divine tapestry, woven into time and space themselves. With its guidance, you walked through a universe that was both beautiful and perilous, always trying to keep your steps aligned with the will of the gods, always living under the watchful light of the fifth sun. Long before the first stone of Tenochtitlan touched the marshy ground, before your people ruled the valley or raised temples from the lake, a promise was whispered in darkness, deep within a primordial cave. It was a promise of blood, of fire, and of an empire whose glory would burn like the sun itself. This was the mandate of Huitzilopochtli, the blue hummingbird of the south, supreme solar deity, ferocious god of war. To you, Mexico, he was not just a distant myth. He was your father, your guide, the fierce engine driving your history. He was the unseen force that pulled your ancestors from the legendary land of Aztlán, that led them across deserts and mountains until, at last, they saw the eagle perched upon the cactus. Huitzilopochtli was the sun-made warrior, locked each day in a real, ongoing battle against the darkness. If he failed, the world would drown in eternal night. To understand him is to feel the weight the Aztecs carried, the belief that the survival of the cosmos itself rested on your armored shoulders, that each step you took in battle helped keep the heavens turning. His birth, as the storytellers recited it, was an eruption of violence atop Calmecac. Snake Mountain, his mother, the earth goddess Tlatelolco, swept a ball of soft, shimmering feathers from the ground, tucked it into her bosom, and found herself mysteriously pregnant. Her daughter, the moon goddess Quetzalcoatl, and her 400 brothers, the star spirits called the Sensan Huitznahua, were enraged and ashamed. Together, they climbed the mountain, weapons in hand, to kill their own mother. But just as they reached the summit, Huitzilopochtli burst from the womb, fully grown and armored for war. In his hand he held the Tlatelolco, the fire serpent, a blazing weapon of celestial power in a storm of divine fury. He decapitated Quetzalcoatl and hurled her body down the mountain. He struck his brothers again and again, scattering the 400 stars across the sky. This mythic battle was not a one-time story to you. It was the pattern by which the cosmos still functioned. Each dawn, Huitzilopochtli rose again, driving back the moon and the stars, winning just one more day for the earth below. Such a struggle demanded fuel. Energy in your world was not an abstract concept. It was blood, it was breath, it was the warmth of a living heart. Huitzilopochtli was a ravenous god, and his chosen nourishment was the precious water of human blood. The contract was stark and simple. He would give light and warmth, the conditions for crops and life, and in return, you would feed him with sacrifice. Because of this, war itself became a holy duty. Every campaign, every captive, every clash of obsidian and bone turned into an offering. Without these offerings, the fifth sun might falter, and all creation might crumble. At the center of this devotion rose the Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan, Huitzilopochtli's great seat of power. Here, upon its high platforms, the blood of thousands flowed over stone, offered so that dawn would keep returning, day after day. Yet despite his hunger, Huitzilopochtli was also your promise, your hope. His very name, blending hummingbird and south, evoked the souls of fallen warriors. You believed that those who died bravely in battle or upon the sacrificial stone did not simply vanish. For 4 years their spirits accompanied the sun, rising with him into the sky, then at last returning to earth in the form of hummingbirds, sipping nectar from flowers, tasting sweetness after the bitterness of war. He was the patron of your city, the whisper in the priest's dreams, the fierce determination that transformed a wandering, despised tribe into rulers of an empire. He was the burning heart of your people, a god of blinding light who demanded everything, yet in turn placed the world at your feet. In the final decades before the Spaniards arrived, his cult blazed brighter than ever. Guided by the statesman Tlaloc, the Mexica elevated Huitzilopochtli above all other gods, recasting history and ritual so that every victory, every conquest, every new temple seemed to flow from his will. Each tributary city brought under your rule became another jewel in the crown of the blue hummingbird, another proof that his mandate was unshakable. As long as copal incense rose from his altars, as long as hearts were offered and drums pounded on festival nights, you believed your son would never fail. Huitzilopochtli became the beginning and the end of your story, a furnace of divine fire that forged a nation of warriors in its heat. In the very center of Tenochtitlan, lifting itself from the water like a man-made mountain, stood the Templo Mayor, the great temple to your people. This structure was not just a building of stone. It was the axis mundi, the navel of the world, the exact point where sky, earth, and underworld touched. The temple anchored the universe, a sacred pivot around which all existence turned, rebuilt and enlarged again and again. 7 times in all, it grew like a living being. Each new layer of stone and plaster covered the last, reflecting the rising power and expanding mandate of the Mexica. As your empire grew, so too did this mountain of worship. Mirroring the swelling strength of the Sun People, the Templo Mayor took the shape of a double pyramid, expressing the dual nature of your cosmos. 2 grand stairways climbed its western face, leading up to twin shrines that crowned the summit. To the north, painted blues and whites shimmered in the light, marking the temple of Tlaloc, ancient god of rain and fertility. Here, offerings were made to summon the waters that fed the Chinampas, the floating gardens that ringed your island city. To the south, a shrine of deep reds rose, adorned with skulls and symbols of war. This was the house of Huitzilopochtli, god of sun and battle, the holiest point in the empire. Here, the myth of Coatepec was relived again and again, ensuring the universe did not unravel. The entire complex spoke in the language of sacred symbolism. The pyramid itself embodied Snake Mountain, the place of Huitzilopochtli's bloody birth. At the base of the southern stairs lay a great circular stone carved with the broken body of Quetzalcoatl, her limbs scattered, her head severed. Every sacrificial victim forced up those steps was made to retrace her defeat, climbing toward the place where heart and blood would be given to the sun, just as she had fallen at the dawn of time. Around the Templo Mayor stretched a sacred precinct, filled with schools, priestly palaces, and a ball court where cosmic dramas unfolded in rubber and stone. All of this was enclosed by a wall carved with serpent heads, marking a clear boundary between the ordinary world and the charged space of the divine. Here, at this towering axis, the might of the state and the passion of religion fused into one. The greatest festivals of the 260-day calendar unfolded on its steps and plazas. Thousands of dancers, musicians, and priests, cloaked in shimmering feathers, moved in shifting patterns. Drums thundered, shells and flutes cried out. Incense smoke curled thick and sweet around you, lifting your senses toward trance, toward communion with beings you could not see. And here, amid the music and the colors, rose also the most chilling spectacles of ritual violence, where devotion and fear, beauty and terror, mingled beneath the gaze of the fifth sun. During the dedication of the temple's final expansion in 1487, the Great Temple became the stage for one of the most staggering rituals your world had ever seen. For 4 long days and nights, captives were led up its steep stone steps in an endless procession. Their hearts were offered to the sky, and their blood flowed down the stairways in dark streams, pooling on the platforms below like crimson rivers. To you, standing in the crowd, the sight was horrifying, and yet, in the Aztec mind, it was also deeply, terribly necessary. Each life given was a spark of fuel for the fifth sun, another measure of strength poured into Huitzilopochtli's eternal battle. Without such offerings, the universe might falter, and the carefully balanced world you knew could collapse back into darkness. This temple was the soul of Tenochtitlan. It was here that the Tlaloc, the speaker, received his divine mandate, standing atop the pyramid while the people watched from the plazas below. It was here that priests observed the stars, tracked the turning of the sacred calendars, and read the subtle signs of fate written across the sky. Beneath its shadow, the destinies of wars, alliances, and kingdoms were weighed and decided. The Templo Mayor was the stone embodiment of a single idea, that the world was fragile, held together not by chance, but by constant human effort and sacrifice. When the Spanish conquistadors first beheld it from the causeways, they felt a mix of awe and revulsion. To them, this man-made mountain was a monument of impossible skill, and yet also a terrifying reminder that this civilization had built its power upon the blood of gods and men alike. When they finally tore it down, block by block, they did more than destroy a temple. They shattered the beating heart of the Mexico world, cut through the axis that held your universe together. To a Western mind, trained to see the world in clear lines of good and evil, light and dark, the Aztec faith can feel bewildering, filled with contradictions and sharp edges. But at its center lay one elegant principle that held everything together: Omadal, duality. Your universe was not a battlefield between equal, opposing absolutes, but a living tension between complementary halves. Night required day, life required death, male required female, order required chaos. Nothing existed alone. Every force leaned upon its opposite like two sides of the same blade. At the peak of this concept stood Omteotl, the two-god, dwelling in Omyakan, the place of duality. The highest level of heaven, Omteotl was both male and female, both mother and father, both light and shadow. From this unified being all other gods and powers descended, spreading across the cosmos like branches from a single invisible root. This pattern echoed throughout the pantheon. For nearly every male deity, there was a female counterpart bearing the other side of his strength. Tlaloc, the rain god, brought storms and growth, but his power was balanced by Tlatelolco, goddess of lakes, rivers, and calm waters, Huitzilopochtli, blazing sun and war, met his cosmic counterpoint in Quetzalcoatl, cool moon and defeat, forever reminding you that triumph and downfall are joined. The deepest expression of this duality lay in how you understood life and death. Death was not a full stop, but a turning of the wheel, a necessary phase in the cycle of regeneration. Life itself was seen as a loan, temporarily granted by the gods, and to be repaid in time. The earth beneath your feet was both gentle mother and devouring maw. She fed you maize and fruit, yet demanded bodies in return to keep her fertile. Blood sacrifice, then, was not mere cruelty, it was repayment, a cosmic exchange. You took life from the earth, and in turn gave life back to earth and sun. Death became the seed from which life would sprout again. This philosophy stood written in stone at the very center of Tenochtitlan. The great temple split in two. Tlaloc on one side, Huitzilopochtli on the other, embodied this balance. Rain and war, fertility and sacrifice, standing side by side on the same summit. Even your government followed this pattern. The Tlatelolco, the speaker, represented the outward-facing, solar, masculine power of the state, commanding armies and diplomacy. At his side stood the Quetzalcoatl, the snake woman, a male official holding a feminine title, managing inner affairs, law and religion, the earthy, internal half of rule. You lived in a world of terrifying beauty, where harmony was not gentle stillness, but a delicate act of balance on a swaying wire. Reality itself was forged from creative destruction, from opposites clashing and embracing. To exist was to stand between immense grinding gears of the cosmos, fully aware that at any moment the balance might slip, and when finally the warmth left your body and your last breath faded into the thin plateau air, your journey was not over, it had only changed path. For those who died quietly, through age or illness, far from the fury of battle or the sacred danger of childbirth, the road led northward, toward Mictlan, the land of the dead. Mictlan was neither heaven nor hell, neither reward nor punishment. It was a vast, shadowed realm, a place of deep stillness at the far edge of the cosmos. To reach it, your soul had to travel for 4 long years, passing through 9 levels of trial. The living prepared you carefully for this journey. They placed offerings by your side, water to quench your thirst, talismans to protect you, and most important of all, a small, hairless dog, Tlatelolco, to serve as your guide. Your path began at the shores of the Anahuac, a wide, churning river that marked the boundary between the living world and the land beyond. Here, Tlatelolco awaited you. Only a dog you had treated kindly in life would agree to help. If you had been cruel, it would turn away, leaving you stranded on the bank. If it accepted you, you climbed onto its back, and together you crossed the cold, restless waters, leaving the sunlit world behind. Beyond the river lay the second level, Tepe Monomixia, where 2 immense mountains crashed against each other again and again, their rocky sides grinding like the teeth of giants. To pass, you had to move with perfect timing, slipping through the gap before the stone jaws closed. Then came Iztapetl, the obsidian mountain, its slopes covered in razor-sharp shards that sliced at your feet with every step. After that stretched Sehucan, 8 desolate plains of ice and snow, where a killing cold crept into your bones, testing your resolve even in death. Deeper still, the trials grew stranger in Huitzilopochtli, the place of the obsidian wind. Invisible gusts cut into you like 1,000 blades, stripping away what remained of your earthly weight. In Temaminoaloyan, unseen archers loosed spectral arrows that struck with the memory of pain, echoes of every wound and sting you had ever known in life. At the 7th level, Tlaloc, beasts waited to devour your heart. Here you faced the last of your attachments and fears, surrendering them one by one, until nothing remained but the quiet core of your being. The 8th level, Tlatelolco lay smothered in thick, suffocating fog, a place where sight, sound, and touch slowly faded, preparing you for what stood at the very bottom of this cosmic descent. Finally, in the 9th level, Chinampas, you arrived before the rulers of this shadowed kingdom, Tlatelolco, Lord of Death, and Mictlantecuhtli, Lady of the Dead. Tlatelolco loomed before you as bone and darkness, a blood-splattered skeleton adorned with a necklace of human eyeballs. His headdress of owl feathers rustling faintly, the birds that carried night upon their wings. At his side sat Mictlantecuhtli, serene and terrible, guardian of all who had ever died. Here, your long journey ended, not in torment, not in radiant bliss, but in a deep, quiet stillness, your essence finally dissolving into the vast, dark calm of Mictlan, as the 5th sun continued its path above, and new lives began again upon the earth you had left behind. The soul would stand before the lords of Mictlan, hands gently lifting the gifts and charms that had been buried alongside its body by grieving family. These offerings were like small echoes of the living world, fragments of love and memory carried into the dark. If Mictlantecuhtli and Mictlantecuhtli were satisfied, they granted the ultimate mercy, the quiet dispersal of the self into the great nothingness. There was no eternal feast here, no endless garden or radiant city. In Mictlan, the final reward was absolute rest, a place where the individual ego dissolved back into the primordial elements of the universe, like smoke fading into the sky, or a drop of rain vanishing into a lake. This myth of Mictlan rested deep in the mind of your people. It taught you that life was temporary, a passing state, and that death was not a sudden cut, but a long refining process. Those 4 years of wandering below mirrored the time it took for a body to decompose and return fully to the earth. The spiritual journey followed the same rhythm as the physical. Because of this, your society learned not to flee from death in terror, but to prepare for it with care and dignity, as one prepares for a long voyage. In the silent hours of the night, when the wind howled through the black obsidian slopes surrounding your valley, you could imagine the millions of souls trudging northward, crossing frozen moors and clashing mountains, each one seeking the final, still embrace of the Lord of the Dead. Above that shadowed realm, the sun that warmed your skin and lit the lakes was never seen as guaranteed. To you, the sky was not a permanent ceiling, but a fragile stage where 4 previous worlds had already appeared and perished. You lived beneath Nahuatl, the 5th sun, ruled by Tenochtitlan, Lord of the Dawn. Tenochtitlan was the face at the center of the great sun stone, a god of blinding brilliance and insatiable hunger. His movement across the heavens each day was a miracle purchased at a terrible cost. To understand Tenochtitlan was to feel the quiet anxiety at the core of every Aztec heart. You believed you were the chosen guardians of a dying star, tasked with keeping back the final darkness through an unending covenant of blood and fire. His story began in absolute night, after the destruction of the 4th sun. In that dim, primordial time, the gods assembled at Teotihuacan, the place where gods are made, to decide who would bear the burden of becoming the new sun. 2 volunteers stepped forward from the divine gathering. Tecuhtlicatl, wealthy, proud, draped in jewels and rare feathers, and Anahuac, humble, diseased, his skin marked with sores. Tecuhtlicatl presented rich offerings, while Anahuac had only his own blood and simple maguey thorns. A great sacrificial fire roared to life, and the gods commanded them to leap into the flames. Tecuhtlicatl tried, but fear gripped him, and 4 times he pulled back from the edge. Anahuac, trembling but resolute, did not hesitate. He shut his eyes and cast himself into the blaze, disappearing in a burst of heat and light. Shamed, Tecuhtlicatl finally followed. Throwing himself into the dying embers from that sacred fire, 2 suns rose into the sky. Their combined light threatened to scorch the world, so one of the gods hurled a rabbit at Tecucisticattl's face, dimming his glow and turning him into the pale, scarred moon. The other, Tenochtitlan, remained in the heavens, terrible and bright, but even then, he did not move. He hung motionless above the earth, refusing to cross the sky until he was properly fed. He demanded the vital energy of the gods themselves in a final, staggering act of sacrifice. The other deities allowed their own blood and life force to be taken, so that the sun could be set in motion. From that moment on, a law ruled your universe. Life would only be possible through death. The sun would move only if it was nourished by the essence of the brave. Tenochtitlan appeared in your carvings as a fierce warrior, his tongue shaped like an obsidian blade, forever extended, forever asking for blood. He was the patron of the elite military orders and the final destination for the souls of fallen warriors. You believed that if Tenochtitlan ever went hungry, he would falter, and the world would shatter under vast earthquakes, ending the age of humans. Each sunrise became a quiet relief, each sunset a gentle tightening of fear. Priests watched the horizon with careful eyes, knowing that time itself depended on their success in feeding the solar hunger. The cult of the fifth sun filled your days with urgent purpose. You were the people of the sun, cosmic workers keeping the machinery of the universe turning. This was not a faith of distant prayer, but of direct participation in a grand struggle. Every ritual, every war, every drop of blood that darkened the stone steps of the Templo Mayor fed the celestial furnace. Tenochtitlan was the radiant, demanding heart of your cosmos, a god who gifted warmth and life, yet always at the cost of the precious water within human veins. In his golden gaze, your people saw both their greatest glory and their inevitable doom, for you knew that even the fifth sun would someday fall silent, long before your ancestors walked the valley as Mexico, before your stone canals and temples cut the lake into glittering paths. The mountains already knew the name of another power, Tlaloc, Lord of the Rain, Master of Fertility. One of the most ancient and beloved deities in all of Mesoamerica, Tlaloc held your life in his wet, storm-darkened hands. He was the giver of the rains that turned dry soil into fields of emerald maize, but also the sender of lightning, hail, and floods that could erase a harvest overnight. He was a god of shifting moods, as changeable as the storm clouds gathering over the Sierra Madre, generous and terrifying all at once. His appearance was as striking as his power. In sculptures and murals, you would recognize him by his great goggled eyes and curving fangs, features that hinted at his deep, primordial origins. His body was painted in rich blues and greens, echoing water, moss, and the dense vegetation he commanded. Often he held a serpent-shaped staff of lightning, a symbol of his ability to rip open the sky with a single stroke. Tlaloc did not labor alone. He was served by the Tlaloc, small, dwarf-like rain spirits who dwelled inside the sacred mountains, hidden in caverns and springs. They watched over 4 great jars aligned with the cardinal directions. Each jar held a different kind of moisture. One contained gentle, nourishing rain, another brought ruinous storms, another frost, another drought or lightning that could scorch a season's hope in an afternoon. Your relationship with Tlaloc was woven from gratitude and fear. In the high altitude of the Mexican plateau, the success of your maize fields depended entirely on the arrival of summer rains. Without them, famine would creep silently across the Chinampas and markets. To win his favor, the priests of Tenochtitlan performed some of the most emotionally charged rites of the year. During the month of Tlatelolco, they carried out a ritual that remains one of the most haunting in Aztec memory, the sacrifice of children to the rain god. This was not seen as mindless cruelty, but as a sorrowful offering built on symbolic logic. The Aztecs believed that the tears of the children mirrored falling rain, If the little ones sobbed before their journey to the gods, it was taken as a sign that Tlaloc would answer with abundant showers, quenching the thirst of fields and forests. Those children were believed to enter Tlaloc's paradise, a realm of eternal springtime, gentle mists, and endless food, reserved for those who died by water drowned, struck by lightning, or claimed in his rituals. While their loss weighed heavily on the living, their souls were thought to run laughing through gardens of flowers, under clouds that never broke into storm. The primary seat of Tlaloc's power towered above your city, Mount Tlaloc, a massive peak to the east. At its heights, where the clouds brushed the earth and the air thinned to a soft whisper, the Aztecs built one of the highest shrines in their world, a place where priests and pilgrims stood quite literally within the realm of the rain god, offering incense, song, and sacrifice to call the waters down upon the waiting land below. This was the place where earth rose to meet the sky, a high, wind-swept threshold where the veil between your world and Tlaloc's grew thin. Up on Mount Tlaloc, priests watched the slow formation of clouds, their shapes, their colors, the way they gathered and broke apart. From these subtle signs, they tried to read the coming of the monsoon, to glimpse whether the maize would grow tall or whether hunger would walk the land. Back in Tenochtitlan, his presence was carved into the very heart of the city. On the north side of the Templo Mayor, a shrine painted in cool blues and whites rose opposite the blood-red sanctuary of Huitzilopochtli. Side by side, war and rain, sword and seed. This perfect architectural balance reminded you, every time you looked up, that your empire needed both the blood of the warrior and the water of the god. One gave the strength to conquer, the other the bread to live. Tlaloc was a god of deep memory. Older than cities, older than kings, even after the empire fell, his echo lingered in mountain villages and along lonely paths. To hear thunder rolling over the valley was to hear Tlaloc's voice, speaking in a low, distant rumble. To see the first tender shoots of maize pushing through the soil was to glimpse his quiet gift. He was the world's hidden gardener, a spirit of mist, rain, and storm who demanded a heavy price, yet offered the only treasure that truly mattered in the end, the continuation of life itself. In the cool, damp shadows of his temples, the Aztecs felt the heartbeat of the earth, a steady rhythm of falling water and growing grain that had sustained humans since time beyond memory. Within this often harsh and frightening pantheon, another presence glowed like soft dawn light, Quetzalcoatl. His name itself held a beautiful paradox. Quetzal, the emerald-plumed bird of the heavens, and Coatl, the serpent that moved along the earth. He was the feathered serpent, the living bridge between sky and soil, spirit and matter. Unlike the blood-hungry war gods or the stormy caprice of Tlaloc, Quetzalcoatl was known above all as a gentle patron of civilization, a bringer of art, craft, and knowledge. He gifted humanity the sacred calendar, showed them how to plant and tend the fields, and, in one beloved tale, took the humble shape of an ant to steal maize from the mountain of sustenance, carrying the first kernels out between the stones so your ancestors would never again starve. Quetzalcoatl had many faces. In his form as Ehecatl, he was the god of the wind, sweeping the path clear for the rain gods, blowing clouds across the sky. Temples to Ehecatl were built in rounded shapes, cylinders that let the wind slip smoothly around their walls, and his priests wore masks like duck beaks, breathing the breath of life onto offerings and altars. He was protector of the priesthood and of learning. The Calmecac, the elite school for nobles, stood under his special care, and the highest priests bore his name as a title, walking the earth as reflections of his wisdom. In the night sky he was linked to Venus, the morning star, that shining herald which disappeared into the underworld only to rise again in the east, a perfect symbol of death and rebirth. But Quetzalcoatl was not only a distant god, he was also remembered as a man, a priest king of a golden age, inherited from the stories of older peoples, especially the Toltecs of Tula. In those tales, Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl ruled a city of wonders, where cotton grew already dyed in brilliant colors, and jewels lay scattered like ordinary stones. He forbade human sacrifice, offering instead birds, butterflies, and serpents, gentle tokens of devotion, yet such purity drew the shadow of envy. In the myths, his dark brother and rival, Tezcatlipoca the Smoking Mirror, wove spells of trickery and humiliation, luring Quetzalcoatl into drunkenness and shame. He drove the sorrowful king from his radiant city. As Quetzalcoatl departed toward the eastern sea, he made a solemn promise. One day, he would return, reclaim his throne, and restore his golden age. This prophecy of the returning Lord drifted through the centuries like a quiet, persistent echo, a pale, bearded figure coming from the east. When, in the year 1 Chuan, 1519, strange wooden towers appeared on the horizon, bearing men unlike any the Mexica had ever seen. Many believed the old promise had come due. Quetzalcoatl, god of culture and creation, thus became also a herald of world-shaking change, the gentle morning star whose rising could signal both renewal and the beginning of the end, the breath that gives life, and the wind that can sweep everything away. If Quetzalcoatl was the soft dawn of the Aztec spirit, his brother Tezcatlipoca was the deep, star-filled night that surrounded it. The Smoking Mirror was perhaps the most feared and complex deity of all, god of the night sky, keeper of ancestral memory, master of sorcery, and ultimate judge of fate. While other gods could be approached with clear offerings and rituals, Tezcatlipoca remained elusive, unpredictable, a shadow you could never quite grasp. He was the shadow of the world, believed to wander unseen through the streets of Tenochtitlan, listening at doorways, weighing hearts. With a flicker of will, he could topple a king or raise a beggar to glory, reminding everyone that the universe was not always gentle or just, but ruled by a vast, inscrutable intelligence that demanded humility from all. His symbol was the obsidian mirror he carried. Tezcatl means mirror, Poca means smoke. This was no mirror of vanity, but a window into hidden truths. In its dark, polished surface, veiled by drifting smoke, he was said to see everything: the secrets people hid, the spinning of the stars, the branching paths of all possible futures. The coiling smoke represented confusion, illusion, the way reality can twist and deceive. In many images, one of his legs ends not in a foot, but in a mirror or a bone, a scar from the ancient battle with the earth monster Cipactli. When he sacrificed his limb to draw the creature forth and shape the world from its body, creation itself, in his story, was born from pain and loss. Tezcatlipoca bore the unsettling title Tlatelolco, he whose slaves we are, a name that captured how small humans felt beneath his gaze. He was patron of both emperors and outcasts, the source of fortune and disaster alike. During the festival of Tezcatl, a flawless young man was chosen to live for a year as the living image of Tezcatlipoca, dressed in fine garments, adored by all. Then, at the cycle's end, he calmly walked to his own sacrifice. This ritual whispered a hard lesson into every watching heart. Beauty, power, wealth are only temporary loans from the smoking mirror, given for a brief moment, then taken back. The eternal tension between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl was the unseen engine of your myths and history, shadow and light, order and disruption, weaving together the story of the Aztec world beneath the cold, watchful stars, when the wind howled through the mountain passes of your land, or when sudden misfortune struck a family. The people knew the smoking mirror was near, his unseen hand quietly rearranging the pieces of their lives like stones in a riverbed. Tezcatlipoca was the god of the cold truth. He did not offer you the soft, comforting wisdom of the feathered serpent, but the sharp, cutting reality of the obsidian blade, held steady and unblinking. He taught that the universe was a place of constant transformation, that no position, no matter how high, was ever truly secure. No throne was permanent, no crown was safe from his shadow. He was the patron of warriors and sorcerers, of those who dared to look beyond the thin veil of the material world. In the drifting smoke of his mirror, the people of the fifth sun saw reflections of their own mortality and the vast, beautiful, and terrifying mystery of the divine surrounding them. He was the darkness that allowed the light to be seen, the silence that allowed the song to be heard, the invisible hand at the center of the Aztec heart. In the quiet, expectant moments before the first green blades of spring pierced the cracked surface of the valley, another god stirred, one who demanded a transformation so deep, so radical, that it defied the simple human instinct to cling to what is known. He was Tlatelolco, our Lord the Flayed One, a terrifying and beautiful embodiment of the earth's renewal, master of the seasons, and divine patron of the goldsmiths. To modern eyes, his imagery is among the most unsettling in the Aztec world. Yet to the Mexica, he was a deity of profound hope, of necessary sacrifice. He represented a universal truth: for new life to begin, the old must be shed with uncompromising force. He was the god of the seed that must lose its hard husk to sprout, the sun that must pull itself out from the skin of the night. His image was a masterpiece of symbolic horror and spiritual depth. He is almost always shown wearing the skin of a sacrificed person, draped over his own body like a macabre suit of armor. The hands of that flayed skin hang limp at his wrists, and the double layer of lips creates a haunting, hollow expression. For your people, this was not cruelty without meaning. It was a mirror of nature. Just as ripening maize loses its dry outer leaves to reveal the golden grain beneath, and just as the earth sheds its brown, lifeless winter coat to reveal the vibrant green of spring, the god wore the skin of the past to bring forth the future. Beneath the pale, decaying yellow of the borrowed hide, his own skin was often painted a vivid, healthy red, symbolizing the raw, pulsing life force that drives the universe forward. At the center of his worship stood the festival of Tlaloc, the feast of the flaying of men, held at the spring equinox, a time when the social and spiritual fabric of Tenochtitlan was renewed thread by thread. For weeks beforehand, chosen captives were honored as the living images of Tlatelolco, dressed in fine garments, treated as sacred embodiments of the god. At the height of the ceremony, they were sacrificed, and their skins were carefully removed by specially trained priests. These priests then wore the skins for 20 days, moving slowly through the streets, dancing in the courtyards, visiting homes, blessing doorways. To the Aztecs, this was a living vision of the earth's own transformation. As the skins dried and turned a golden, yellowish hue, they became symbols of ripening maize, swelling fields, and approaching abundance, a quiet promise that life was returning once again. Tlatelolco was also the revered patron of the goldsmiths, the artisans who coaxed beauty out of raw stone and dull metal, turning the hidden veins of the earth into shimmering ornaments for rulers and priests. The connection was clear. When gold was cast, a rough outer mold was broken away to reveal a perfect, shining form within, a direct parallel to the god's flayed skin. Gold itself was called the excrement of the sun, a divine substance that shared the life-giving essence of Tenochtitlan's rays. By honoring Tlatelolco, the goldsmiths were not merely practicing a trade. They were participating in sacred alchemy, the great work of refining spirit from matter, of drawing beauty from decay. The legacy of the Flayed Lord whispered through every corner of Aztec thought. You lived in a world where growth was never free, where seasons were sustained through a constant cycle of debt and repayment. Tlatelolco was the god of painful but necessary transitions. He taught that every crossing from childhood to adulthood, from peace to war, from winter to spring, required the shedding of a former self, in the dry rustle of maize husks in the wind, and in the molten glow of the goldsmith's fire. Your people sensed his presence, the god who wore the face of death to guarantee the return of life. He was the golden seed of the empire, proof that even in the darkest, most macabre rituals, the promise of dawn always waited just beneath the surface. For centuries, beneath the dust and cobblestones of what is now Mexico City, a silent giant of basalt slept, a great circular stone whose carvings hold the heartbeat of the Aztec universe. This was the Piedra del Sol, the great sun stone, often mistaken for a simple calendar, but in truth something far greater, a cosmic map, a statement of power, and a warning carved into volcanic rock. Weighing more than 24 tons and stretching 12 feet across, this monolith once stood as the centerpiece of the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, a towering declaration that the Mexica stood at the very center of time and space. To gaze upon the sun stone was to look straight into the depths of Aztec history, a place where past, present, and future folded into one another under the gaze of the gods. At its very center, the face of Tenochtitlan, the fifth sun, stares outward. His tongue is a sacrificial flint blade, forever hungry for the vital energy that keeps the world turning. Around him lie 4 square panels, each marking one of the previous suns, the eras of Jaguar, wind, reign of fire, and water. Each world ended in catastrophe, and their carved symbols served as a constant reminder that this current age was just as fragile. Your people believed they lived in the final epoch, an age destined to end in earth-shaking ruin. The sun stone stood like a prayer in stone, a plea to the gods to delay the coming darkness, as long as the people of the sun continued their devotions. Encircling Tenochtitlan is a ring of the 20-day signs of the Tlatelolco, the sacred 260-day calendar, from crocodile to flower. Each symbol represented a unique current of spiritual energy, shaping every birth, every decision, every offering laid upon the altars. Beyond this ring flow bands of celestial symbols, stars, rays of sunlight, precious jewels. All of it is held within the bodies of 2 vast fire serpents, the Huitzilopochtli. Their tails meet at the top. Their heads confront each other at the bottom. These serpents personify the heat and light of the sun, the blazing forces that carry Tenochtitlan across the sky each day. Their presence on the outer rim tells a quiet truth, that the entire universe is wrapped in divine fire, a power that both creates and consumes. The great sun stone was also a message of earthly power, a piece of imperial vision set in stone. By placing their gods, their calendar, and their understanding of time at its center, the rulers of Tenochtitlan proclaimed their divine right to rule the world they knew, most likely carved during the reign of Quetzalcoatl in the late 15th century, when the empire was near its greatest reach. It stood as both a work of devotion and a reminder that even empires, like suns, rise and one day must fall into shadow. The stone was more than a sacred object. It was a promise carved in rock, a quiet statement of order in a shifting, uncertain world, standing in the sacred precinct. The great sunstone declared that the Mexica alone held the knowledge to keep the fragile balance of the cosmos intact. It watched over ceremonies and rulers like a patient, unblinking eye, a testament to their mathematics, their artistry, and their vast, carefully structured vision of reality. When the Spanish arrived, and the old temples were pulled down stone by stone, the sun stone was cast aside, buried as a new city of churches and plazas rose above it. For centuries it slept in the dark, forgotten beneath the cobblestones, until 1790, when it finally emerged again from the earth, like a ghost rising from the deep layers of time. Today it is perhaps the most iconic symbol of Mexico's indigenous past. A masterpiece of carving that still seems to whisper the secrets of the Mexica to anyone who gazes into its patterns. It reminds you that for the Aztecs, time was not a straight line, but a great turning wheel, a cycle of birth, death, and return that required constant human attention to keep moving. In the still, frozen spirals of the sun's stone, you can feel the lingering soul of an empire that once believed itself to be the guardian of the light. While the heart of Tenochtitlan beat with the drum of war and the thud of sacrificial rituals, across the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco there glowed another kind of power, one woven from thought, beauty, and careful reflection. This was Texcoco, often called the Athens of the New World, and at its center stood a ruler unlike any other. Huitzilopochtli, the fasting coyote. He was a king, a maker of laws, an architect and engineer, but above all, a poet-philosopher who dared to look past the blood-stained altars of his time, searching instead for the deepest nature of reality. In a world of strict ritual and cosmic debt, he allowed a softer voice to be heard, a voice of doubt, wonder, and quiet sadness. To walk through his words is to discover the thinking heart of the Aztec world, where the fragile life of a flower was seen as the truest mirror of human existence. His own life was a path of hardship and renewal, born a prince. He watched his father murdered by rivals and spent long years as a fugitive, hiding in forests and mountains, fasting, enduring, learning patience and cunning. From this suffering came his name, the fasting coyote. When he finally reclaimed his throne, he did not turn Texcoco into a place of blind revenge. Instead, he shaped it into a center of learning and grace. He founded libraries and gardens, crafted laws that were admired across the valley, and built terraces and aqueducts that blended engineering with beauty. In quiet moments, wandering the gardens of Tezcatzingo with their flowing water and rare plants, he composed the poems that would carry his name through centuries. He spoke of in Xochitl and Quetzalcoatl, flower and song, the Nahuatl image for art, poetry, and the only truth humans can truly hold in a world made of shadows. Again and again, his verses return to one haunting theme, impermanence. Is it true that one lives on earth? He asked. Not forever on earth, only a little while here. He compared human life to a flower that blooms for a moment and then falls, to a painted book whose colors fade and disappear. This was not despair, but an invitation, a gentle reminder to treasure the song while it is still being sung. His poetry balanced the grandeur of the empire, quietly telling even the mightiest rulers that jade, feathers, and stone palaces would one day crumble to dust. Most striking of all was his search for a different kind of God, while he respected the old deities. Huitzilopochtli became convinced that beyond them stood a single, invisible presence, which he named Tlaloc Anahuac, the Lord of the near and the far, the giver of life. He built a special temple in Texcoco with no idols, no images, only flowers and incense as offerings. He believed this highest force could not be captured in stone or fed with blood, but could only be approached through beauty, thought, and sincerity of heart. In the midst of a polytheistic world, this was a quiet, astonishing step toward a more hidden, universal God. His words survived the fires of conquest, carried in memory and preserved in fragile codices. Even now, his poems are central to Mexico's sense of itself, a reminder that the Aztec world was not only warriors and sacrifices, but also philosophers asking the same eternal questions that still echo in your own mind. He taught that though we are like willows that must one day fall, the flowers and songs we create are the part of us that can touch the divine. In the verses of the fasting coyote, the Aztec spirit found its most delicate expression, accepting the sadness of death, yet celebrating, even more deeply, the brief, shining miracle of life. All the while, an old prophecy continued to murmur beneath the surface of time. The Aztecs had always believed the fifth sun would end. The only uncertainty was when. In the year 1 read, 1519 by the European count, that distant shadow reached the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. When Hernán Cortés and his small band of Spaniards stepped onto the sand, they were more than strangers from another kingdom. To many Mexica eyes, they were a disturbance in the cosmic order itself, encased in steel, riding animals that seemed half monster, carrying weapons that spoke with thunder and smoke. They arrived during the very window foretold for Quetzalcoatl's possible return. The coincidence plunged Emperor Montezuma II into doubt and paralysis, caught between diplomacy, fear, and faith. The fall of Tenochtitlan unfolded not as a single blow, but as a long breaking of a world, a painful transformation with no way back. The Spaniards and their indigenous allies fought with an intent to conquer and dismantle, while the Aztecs fought to capture and ritually bind their enemies. Two visions of war collided in the lake city's causeways and courtyards. There was a brief moment of uneasy peace, a surreal meeting in the heart of Tenochtitlan, where the gleaming wealth of the Mexica court faced the grim resolve of the newcomers. But harmony could not last. A massacre at the great temple during a religious festival set the city aflame with rage. The Spanish fled in chaos during the Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, many drowning or falling along the causeways, and for a little while, it seemed the fifth sun might yet survive. But the deepest wound came from an enemy no warrior could see. Smallpox, carried across the ocean, spread through the valley with terrible speed. The Mexica had no defenses against it, and whole neighborhoods fell silent. While Cortés rebuilt his strength and gathered thousands of native allies who longed to break Aztec power, Tenochtitlan was weakened from within. When the Spaniards returned with brigantines to control the waters of the lake, the once brilliant city was already hollowed by grief and hunger. For 80 days, the Aztecs defended every street and temple with fierce determination. The young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, the descending eagle, led the final resistance, holding to courage even as the city cracked and burned around him. On August 13, 1521, the struggle ended. The great temple had become a smoking ruin, and the last defenders could fight no more. The capture of Cuauhtémoc marked not just the fall of an empire, but the dimming of an entire cosmic vision. The stones of the pyramids were taken down and reshaped into churches and palaces. The sacred texts were burned, and the voices of the old priests fell silent. Over the ruins of Tenochtitlan grew a new colonial capital, laid out in straight lines, as if to press the memory of the past beneath its weight. And yet, a people who believed so fully in cycles and rebirth could not entirely vanish. The blood of the Mexica flowed into a new nation. Their gods, renamed or hidden, continued to whisper in customs, stories, and festivals under the central square. The great sun's stone waited in the darkness, listening to the passing centuries. Today, the legacy of the Aztecs stands not as a tale of simple destruction, but as a testament to human imagination and spiritual depth. They were builders of a universe filled with piercing light and deep shadow, a civilization that found the divine in stars, in flowers, and in the fragile breath of each life. The fifth sun did not simply go out, it changed shape, leaving behind a lasting echo in the valley's dust and in the night sky above. A reminder that even when a sun sets, the stories of the brave continue to glow among the stars.